Hi all, nice to see you again, or not see you, but hopefully you can see me. This session is a very quick intro to resilience. All right, now you guys work in the animal profession. You've heard these words before. This has probably been shoved down your throat either by your organization's EAP provider or over and over again by various different companies that we all work for. And I'm really pleased that that is starting to become much more normal and much more accepted, that if we work in these industries which have such high emotional drain, that we're having these conversations a lot more. The challenge that I have as somebody who comes specifically from this industry, from being a veterinarian, from running veterinary clinics, running animal shelters, running zoo departments, running animal management departments, is that I noticed two things. Firstly, we get no help on how to actually apply that stuff in the real world. Like, they give you really useful things like always make sure you take your lunch breaks or never take your work home with you, while we've literally got bottle feeding kittens keeping us up every 2 hours overnight. Or, you can't not skip your lunch break when there's a blocked cat waiting for you. Like, when we get this training from corporate psychologists, often they're just shocked by the stuff that we do, and they have really unrealistic, unhelpful approaches to what we should do about it, or just stop doing euthanasias or something really unhelpful. So a lot of what I do is about how do we apply best practice stuff to our profession in a meaningful, realistic way. All right. But also, and that's what today's session is about, there is so much old school stuff going on there that's kind of outdated now. And so we still talk about things like compassion fatigue, which is a genuine thing, but probably we've moved on from that now. So that's what this session is about. What are the myths? What are the misnomers? What are we kind of a bit outdated on? And just giving people a really up-to-date view on what are we talking about. And it sounds really weird because I'm somebody who's really focused on the practical, like what can you do? What actions can you take? And yet I actually do have to spend a bunch of time going really back to foundational definitions of things, which is something that I'm usually against, except in this setting, as I hope you'll see as we go forward, without us all having the same language and the shared definitions and the right semantics, we're actually missing the point on quite a lot. And we are probably speaking a different language to each other, which means we're not asking for the right help. We're not supporting each other in a meaningful way. And we don't really understand what's going on in our head to know how to seek the right support. So that is what this is about. Just some really foundational definitions, which I know sounds like it's going to be boring, but I suspect that most of you might be surprised by some of what we're going to talk about. So what is resilience really? Most of you should have kind of heard some of the stuff. Then we're going to go into compassion fatigue. And is it really what's going on? We're going to talk about moral trauma and moral residue, which some of you may or may not heard of. And we're going to talk about positive psychology and toxic positivity and what's the difference. Okay, so who am I? If you've been to my other talk, you know this. I'm a mum. I'm a dog mum. I am a vet. I am an ex-shelter manager. I've run 5 or 6 different animal shelters around Australasia, South Pacific kind of areas now. And I run Unleashed Coaching and Consulting, which is aiming to keep animal professionals in the animal profession. So work with teams on resilience and work with leaders on making leadership sustainable as well, but also how do they create cultures and systems and infrastructure that doesn't require quite as much resilience from their teams, whilst recognizing the reality of the sort of professions that we work in. So resilience 101, right? Most of you should have heard some of this if you've had any basic intro to resilience, but worth noting what resilience is not. Okay, so most of us might have heard the analogy of the rubber band, right? You pull a rubber band really tight and let go. And if it goes back to the same shape that it used to be, it's resilience, right? It bounces back. You apply a stressor and then it bounces back. If you get those really cheap rubber bands where you can get 100 for $2 at Bunnings and you pull them and then you let them go and they kind of become this fractured, flaccid, sort of intermittent bits of just material that will disintegrate quite quickly. That's a less resilient rubber band. Useful-ist definition for the kind of point that it's about Sometimes it's okay to be stretched. Sometimes it's okay to not be okay for a little bit. As long as when that stressor is released, we can return to feeling a bit like our normal selves, or at least a version of ourselves that we like, even if we grow from it and aren't exactly the same as we were. But the important point here is what resilience is not. And as a general rule, resilience is not what our parents and grandparents thought that resilience was. Robustness. Robust, strong, I got this. Nope, I can handle this. I can handle lots of workload. I'm fine. We don't talk about not being okay. That robust approach, that is not the same as resilience, okay? And in fact, they've kind of proved at elite level military training that there is a negative correlation between the tougher somebody acts and physically is and their likelihood of surviving the elite level SAS type of training. So what that really means is that we can shift away from this assumption that those who talk about not being okay are less resilient. Okay. Think of it. So we've got the rubber band for resilience. I put the brick wall for robustness. Like, I've got this. I can hold. I can take a bunch of hits. I'm not falling. I'm not falling. But once there is a crack, once it falls down, rebuilding that is really, really challenging. Okay. And this is where people who are experiencing genuine, proper burnout, they don't recover with a couple of weeks off work. On average, it takes 6 months to 2 years to properly recover from a burnout episode. Some people much longer. It's because when you've got that brick wall as your protective mechanism, it falling down and you having to rebuild it is really challenging. Whereas if your survival mechanisms are about stretch, about not being okay, but taking the steps to make sure that you don't go overwhelm, then coming back, then even though we have periods of not being okay, we recover from those quite well, right? So that is one of the most important things. Foundational level of resilience is it's not the same as robustness. It's also important to know that we don't kind of sit at one stage our whole lives. You will be feeling fragile sometimes and robust sometimes and resilient sometimes. It's okay to fall back on robustness for a week or a month or to get you through a really difficult, small, finite period. It's just not a long-term strategy that is going to work. And lately we've moved towards the more aspirational, what we call anti-fragile, which is kind of a fancy way of saying resilience. So you stretch, but then actually we learn from that and we take something from that and we become even better than we were before. Great aspiration. Lots of people do this very successfully in a lot of settings. I hesitate to suggest that it should be your overall ambition all of the time, because I think that leans us towards being a bit susceptible to toxic positivity, that everything should have a silver lining and that you should be able to grow from all of your negative experience. I think that that's really unfair to set people up with that kind of view of what they can and should do. Some things are just hard and you just bounce back to going, phew, I'm pleased that's over. Like, there doesn't have to be a lesson or a learning or a growth in everything for it still to be resilient. So, yeah, sure, it is great if we could take negative experiences and find something that helps us grow. I just think that that being the antithesis of fragile is a little bit setting us up to veer towards toxic positivity, which we will touch on a little bit at the end if I have time, depending on how much I talk. But now getting into the stuff that a lot of people don't necessarily get as their foundational stuff for resilience, because a lot of the time in our profession, when we've been talking about mental health and well-being, we have been talking about compassion fatigue, right? Everybody's mostly heard the term. Generally, it's talked about as, sort of caring so much that you run out of caring. You're kind of overwhelmed by giving so much compassion that you don't have any left to give. And this is a real thing, sort of, with some caveats, okay? Firstly, the concept is real, okay? The ability to kind of give so much of yourself that you sort of feel really depleted with not having more to give is a real concept, except it's the wrong word. Empathy fatigue or empathy distress is the correct words for what we just described. Now, remember I said at the beginning that semantics matter more than you think. So stick with me for just a minute, even though it sounds like I'm into boring academic stuff, okay? The difference between empathy and compassion is the difference between being in it with someone and being in it for someone. So I feel with you versus I feel for you. Compassion, I feel for you. And the thing with compassion is that you are safer. Okay, your emotional drain is lower, but also, and really importantly, people that are feeling compassion, it is an emotion that drives us to action. We are much more likely to take steps to try to alleviate somebody's suffering if we feel for them. Empathy, on the other hand, is the experience of feeling in it with them. Okay, so we mirror their emotions and we take on their emotions. And that's where we get things like secondary trauma and empathy distress, because empathy requires us to have this emotional roller coaster of, oh, I'm vaccinating new puppies and aren't they cute and aren't they cute? And also now I'm euthanizing a litter of kittens with cat flu. And feel for each of those animals, or if you're in a public setting with those owners, as if that's our own emotions. And that is draining, so draining, that emotional roller coaster. And we're quite susceptible to those, taking on the secondary trauma of stuff. Now, the other thing to know is that you can feel good to like, oh no, it's good that I'm an empathetic person. Now, sometimes it is great to be an empathetic person, okay? If your friend is having a difficult time, if you've got a family member that's in the thick of something, or if there is one particular case that is really the one that you're championing, then I'm not saying, we're empathetic people that go into this profession. I'm not asking you to give that up. I'm asking you to remember, though, that remember I talked about compassion being an emotion that drives us to action? The thing with empathy is because we're often feeling the feelings with them, who, in your experience, when you are feeling really low or when you are feeling really overwhelmed with emotions, yours or someone else's, when we are low, we tend to not be very action orientated. Like it's hard to take action when things are overwhelming or are highly emotive, right? You kind of get stuck. You either get a paralysis or you get defeated. So actually, there's evidence that people experiencing high levels of empathy are less good at helping. So the reason that semantics matters after all of that it maybe isn't compassion fatigue, but it might be empathy fatigue or empathy distress, is because not only is it safer to practice compassion over empathy, we're better at helping if we practice compassion over empathy, right? But you do get to choose. And this is where people fight me a little bit on it because, yep, all right, overly empathetic people, we are predisposed to that in our profession. Oh, it's just how I am. It is true that it is hard to resist, and some people are much more likely genetically or epigenetically to take on the emotions of people around them, and others are more buffered from that. But we still, by being aware of it, by noticing what's going on in our head, by asking ourselves regularly or self-reflecting, am I in it with them or am I in it for them? And how is that helping me and how is that serving them? Simply by being aware, you can challenge yourself to stay in the safer zone. All right. It's not going to be perfect. All right. But with practice of noticing your own emotions and what you're taking on from other people and how that's coming out as action, you can start to protect yourself from some of the long-term challenges. So you start to see why words matter, right? But I'm going to take this even one step further and go, okay, so empathy distress is a real thing. Empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue is kind of the wrong name, but that's okay. What I'm going to go one step further and say is it even empathy fatigue that we're feeling? I do a lot of work with teams and individuals experiencing challenges in the workplace. And yeah, absolutely. Some people do describe very similar emotions and trajectories to what this is. But a lot of them are using the term and it's not actually what's going on. It's just the only words they've ever been given to talk about how hard it is to work in these highly emotive training professions. So I want to introduce you to a concept that some of you may not have heard of, right? And that is moral trauma, also called moral injury, moral stresses. They are all slightly different, but mostly can be used interchangeably at our surface level introduction. All right. Moral trauma is something that they've studied. It comes from, in fact, the American medical profession, where they have a lot of similarities from us in that they usually went into the profession because they care and they want to make a difference. But you've got doctors and nurses having to turn people away in a waiting room that are bleeding because you don't have insurance, or they're having to bankrupt people to pay for chemotherapy, or, they have to watch people not be able to have a transplant for their kid because they're from a low-income family or their insurance doesn't cover that. So what they've studied, because the American medical profession has some money to do such studies, is what happens over time that each of these little injuries to your morals. Okay, so every time that you either act outside of your ethical compass or you witness something outside of your moral compass and you are not in a position to do anything about it, it causes this tiny little trauma, tiny little moral injury, right? And what they've shown is that repeated moral traumas over time compound in the brain to effectively show the same type of brain patterns as people coming back from military with PTSD. This is actually doing long-term damage to people. And so this is why, again, coming back to that point, that knowing what's going on and knowing the right words for things matter. Because if we go asking for help with compassion fatigue or even for empathy fatigue, and in fact, what's going on is moral trauma, either our friends or our colleagues or our managers or even our therapist might not really be knowing what is going on in our head and therefore the right ways to support that. So I really encourage you to look into moral trauma, okay, and just see if this is something that you've been feeling high levels of difficulty emotionally at work or low levels of well-being, and you historically put it in that compassion fatigue camp. Maybe it's worth just investigating whether you're confident that that's what's happening, all right? The other thing to know about moral trauma is it leaves what they call a residue, which basically is that every time you have these little moral distresses, you never quite come back down to normal, right? You've always kind of then got this buildup of moral residue. And what that means is that often when people experience kind of really big events where they have emotional breakdowns or have to really remove themselves from the workplace for a long time, it's often over something really quite small. It's something that they've done a million times before, euthanasia that's never previously caused a major issue, or an incident with a colleague, or one client yells at you, even though you get a client yell at you every day. Often the thing that finally does it is something you've experienced and handled and had the resilience for before, but this time the residue left there from previous experiences was too great, right? And we're talking about PTSD levels of changes in your brain. So, unhelpfully, in my 20 minutes, I don't have heaps of time to talk about the solutions and the protections and the positives around this. But what I do have is I just want to touch on one thing, okay? One shift in a lot of the stuff we talk about, right? We talk a lot about all of the ways to remove some of these negative experiences in our workplace, okay? We talk a lot about compassion fatigue and maybe even moral trauma or all of the things that go on that make our work hard. We rarely talk about compassion and satisfaction and spend enough time really noticing and focusing and debriefing on compassion satisfaction moments. But I also just want to introduce you to the concept of positive psychology. And what positive psychology is the concept of moving away. So historically, psychology has always sort of assumed fixing pathology of the brain, right? Getting people who have mental ill health up to normal, as opposed to getting people who have health to thriving. So it's all about really trying to go, is it okay? Are we aiming for just surviving? just to not be not okay? Or do we want to do better than that? Do we want to thrive? And positive psychology is about going, well, if all I ever do and I'm trying to create a nice garden is pull the weeds out because I'm focusing on all the bad stuff and weeding my garden all the time, but I forget to plant any flowers or water them or, give them whatever it is that flowers need to grow, I'm not going to have a really great garden. I'm just going to have a weedless garden with grass. Like, who wants that? So I also really want to shift some of the conversation forward, where we've talked a lot historically about protective mechanisms from bad stuff. I will really challenge us to start going, how do we plant more flowers and water those and create a garden that's not just void of weeds? Because we know that's impossible, but that there is enough beauty in it that when the weeds creep through, we go, well, that's part of life. We have bad experiences. We have some weeds in our garden, but it's not the focus of the garden because we've got all of these other things that are buffering us. Okay. And that's how we know that we're not doing toxic positivity, because toxic positivity is about the pretending the weeds aren't there, pretending everything's great, pretending everything's positive, and we're always anti-fragile and getting a silver lining out of everything. We don't want to shift into that mindset. That's unhelpful. But we do want to shift into a mindset of going, okay, there's bad stuff. We want to spend some time working on that. But let's move beyond that. Let's not accept not having mental ill health as the baseline for doing well. And I'm sorry that I've run out of time, as usual. There's so much to say. And if you want the presentation, feel free to request it at that QR code or get in touch if I can help you any further in the future. Have an awesome rest of your G to Z.